The alarm tore through the meridian before I even opened my eyes. Red light washed over the walls of my quarters, pulsing in a rhythm that meant only one thing. Something had entered our system that should not exist. I was on my feet before I finished waking up, pulling my uniform jacket over my shoulders as I ran down the narrow corridor toward the command deck. Other officers moved around me, their faces tight, their steps quick but controlled. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was panicking. We had trained for 100 emergencies, but none of us had trained for this. When I reached the command deck, the main screen showed something that made my chest go cold. 3 massive shapes hung against the black of space, far larger than anything human hands had ever built. They were not moving like ships. They moved like they owned the space around them, like gravity itself had agreed to step aside. Commander Laura Bennett stood at the center of the room, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the screen. She did not turn when I approached her side. "Report," she said, her voice flat and steady. "Unknown vessels, 3 of them, holding position just past the orbit of Neptune," said the officer at the sensor station. His name was Nathan Price, and his hands were shaking slightly, even though his voice stayed calm. "They are broadcasting on every channel we have, audio and visual both." "Put it through," Bennett said. The screen shifted. A shape appeared, tall and thin, with skin the color of wet stone, and eyes that did not blink. It wore no armor, no uniform, nothing that suggested rank or ceremony. It simply stood there, as if it had done this 1,000 times before and felt nothing about doing it again. "This is a formal notice," the being said. Its voice was smooth, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You are addressed by a representative of the Thren Compact. Your species has been surveyed and judged. You consume resources without limit. You expand without restraint. You have shown no capacity for peaceful cooperation with your own kind, let alone with others. By the law of the Compact, your civilization is classified as a growing threat to galactic stability." Nobody on the command deck said a word. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. "Effective immediately," the being continued. "A state of war exists between the Thren Compact and the species known as humanity. This is not a negotiation. This is not a warning. It is a declaration. Your systems will be neutralized. Your population will be reduced to a manageable number. This process is not personal. It is necessary." The transmission ended. The screen returned to the image of the 3 vessels, still hanging silently in the dark. I looked around the room, waiting for someone to say something, anything. Instead, I saw something strange settle over the faces of the people around me. It was not fear, though fear was there too. It was something else, something older, a kind of quiet, burning refusal. Bennett finally spoke. "Get me a line to Earth Command, now." Within minutes, our screens filled with faces from every corner of the planet. Generals, prime ministers, scientists, engineers, all of them speaking over each other in a dozen languages before falling into an uneasy silence. I remember thinking that this was the moment humanity would either fall apart or come together, and I did not know which one we were about to see. It came together. Within an hour, fleets that had never once operated as a single force began aligning their communication systems. Nations that had spent decades arguing over borders and resources suddenly found themselves sharing defense codes without hesitation. I watched leaders who had never trusted each other agree, in the span of a single call, to place their forces under a shared command structure. Nobody argued about who would be in charge. Nobody wasted time on pride. There was only one goal now, and everyone understood it without needing to be told twice. I remember one exchange in particular, between a general from one hemisphere and an admiral from the other, 2 people who had spent years locked in careful, guarded diplomacy over shared waters and disputed resources. When the admiral asked how quickly ships could be repositioned to reinforce a weak point in our orbital coverage, the general did not hesitate, did not ask for anything in return, did not mention old grievances. He simply said, "Send me the coordinates," and the ships were moving within the hour. It struck me, watching that exchange, that I was witnessing something history books would spend generations trying to explain. Every old rivalry, every long-standing dispute, every careful boundary drawn between nations across centuries of conflict, all of it quietly stepped aside the moment something from beyond our world told us we did not deserve to exist. It was not that our disagreements disappeared. It was that, for the first time in memory, all of humanity agreed on something more important than any of them. I stood near the communication station, watching Laura Bennett coordinate with officers half a world away, as if she had done it every day of her life. Her voice never rose, her hands never shook. When someone asked her if she believed we could survive this, she simply said, We do not have the luxury of believing otherwise. 2 hours after the declaration, the first Thren vessel moved. It did not aim for a major city. It did not aim for a capital or a military base. Instead, it turned toward a small research outpost on the far side of the moon, a place with barely 200 people and no weapons capable of threatening a ship of that size. I understood immediately what they were doing. They were sending a message, not fighting a war. They wanted us to see how easily they could erase something small, so we would imagine what they could do to something large. The outpost commander, a woman named Grace Whitfield, refused to evacuate. Her voice came through on an open channel, calm despite the storm rising outside her windows. "If this is meant to frighten us," she said, "then let it be recorded that we were not afraid." The Thren vessel opened fire. A single beam, wide and precise, tore into the outpost's outer shielding. Warning systems blared across every connected screen on Earth and in orbit. For a moment, it looked as though the outpost would be lost entirely. But it wasn't. Grace Whitfield's people had spent the last 2 hours doing something the Thren clearly had not expected. They had rerouted every available system into their shields, stripped power from anything non-essential, and reinforced their defenses using methods no alien intelligence report could have predicted. Because those methods came from decades of human engineers solving problems with whatever scraps they had on hand. The outpost held. It held. On the command deck of the Meridian, a ragged, disbelieving cheer rose up before anyone could stop it. Bennett allowed herself the smallest smile before raising a hand for silence. "They will try again," she said. "And they will not make the same mistake twice, neither will we." I stood there, staring at the screen, watching the Thren vessel pull back in what looked almost like confusion. It had expected collapse. It had expected fear. Instead, it had found a group of unarmed engineers who refused to let go of what was theirs. I later learned that Grace Whitfield's team had done something else during those 2 frantic hours, something that never made it into the official reports but that spread quietly among the crews who heard about it afterward. Instead of simply reinforcing shields and waiting, several of her engineers had rigged makeshift sensor buoys from spare parts and scattered them just beyond the outpost's perimeter, hoping to gather any scrap of data on the incoming weapon before it struck. It was a desperate, almost reckless idea, the kind of thing that could only come from people who understood they might not survive the next hour and had decided to make that hour useful regardless. That data, gathered in the final minutes before the attack, became the very first piece of real intelligence humanity possessed about Thren weapon systems. It would later prove essential to the modifications made to our shielding technology, the same modifications that would go on to save countless lives in the battles still ahead of us. Grace Whitfield never spoke publicly about the decision to gather that data, instead of focusing purely on defense. When asked about it later, she simply said that engineers solve problems, and a problem left unsolved simply because it was frightening was not a habit she intended to start on the worst day of her life. I thought about the being's voice on that first transmission. This process is not personal, it is necessary. I wondered if they understood yet how wrong they were, on both counts. Because for us it was personal. It was about to become the most personal thing any of us had ever lived through. And as for necessary, I had a feeling the Thren Compact was about to learn a very different definition of that word. By the end of that first day, something had changed across the entire planet. Fear was still there, buried under the surface of every conversation, every glance toward the sky. But underneath the fear was something stronger. A quiet, stubborn resolve that spread from city to city faster than any official broadcast could have carried it. Laura Bennett called a meeting of senior officers that night, myself included. She stood at the head of the table, tired but unshaken, and laid out what she believed was coming. "They think we are simple," she said. "They think we will break because we are small compared to them. But smallness has never stopped us before. We have survived worse than strangers from the dark telling us we do not deserve to exist." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Nathan Price, still pale from the events of the day, asked the question that was on all our minds. "What do we do now?" Bennett looked around the table, meeting each of our eyes in turn before she answered. "Now," she said, "we show them exactly what they decided to fight." I did not sleep that night. None of us did. Instead, I stood at the observation window of the Meridian, looking out at the distant lights of the Thren vessels, and I understood, with a certainty I had never felt about anything before, that this was only the beginning. The Thren Compact had come expecting an easy war. They had delivered their declaration with the confidence of a species that had done this before, many times, against many worlds. But they had never faced a world like ours, not yet. And somewhere out there, in the cold silence between their ships and our planet, I believed they were only now beginning to feel the first faint edge of doubt. 3 days after the declaration, the Thren Compact sent a full strike group toward the edge of our solar system, and I was given command of a squadron for the first time in my career. I had trained for years to fly interceptors, but nothing about that training prepared me for the sight of a Thren strike group forming up beyond the orbit of Mars. There were 12 vessels, arranged in a formation so precise it looked almost mathematical, moving with a discipline that suggested centuries of practiced warfare. My squadron of 6 ships felt impossibly small next to them. Laura Bennett's voice came through my headset, steady as always. "Elias, your orders are simple. Draw them toward the Kessler line. Do not engage directly. Let the trap do its work." "Understood," I said, though my hands were tight on the controls. The plan had been built overnight by a team of engineers and strategists working without rest, using every scrap of data we had gathered from the outpost attack. Human ships were faster and smaller than anything the Thren fielded, built for tight turns and rapid changes in direction rather than brute strength. Our tacticians had noticed something important in the outpost recordings. The Thren vessels moved with incredible power, but they moved slowly when changing course, as though their systems were built for overwhelming force rather than quick reaction. We were about to test that theory with our lives. I led my squadron in a wide arc, close enough to draw attention but far enough to avoid direct fire. The Thren strike group noticed us almost immediately and began to shift formation, 12 ships turning as one to pursue 6. For a moment, I felt a flash of pure fear, watching that much power align itself toward my tiny ship. "Steady," I said over the comm, more for myself than for my pilots. "Stay on course. Let them come." Beside me, my second in command, a sharp young pilot named Ryan Blake, kept his voice light despite the tension. "They really do not like being ignored, do they?" "No," I said. "I do not think they are used to it." We led them exactly where we wanted them to go, through a corridor of scattered debris left over from decades of orbital construction projects, a graveyard of old satellites and abandoned station fragments that most ships avoided out of simple caution. The Thren showed no such caution. Confidence, or arrogance, or simply unfamiliarity with our junk-filled skies, carried them straight through. That was their mistake. Hidden among that debris were 60 small drones, built in secret over the past 2 days using whatever manufacturing capacity we could spare. They were crude by Thren standards, nothing more than simple explosive charges wrapped in scavenged plating, but they did not need to be advanced. They only needed to be numerous, and hidden, and patient. The moment the Thren strike group entered the debris field, the drones activated. What followed was not a clean, elegant battle. It was chaos, fire, and confusion. 60 small charges detonating against Thren hulls faster than their shields could adjust to compensate. I watched 2 of their vessels lose power entirely, drifting silently amid the wreckage. A third began venting atmosphere in a long, glittering trail. "Now," Bennett's voice came through, sharp with something close to satisfaction. "Hit them now." My squadron broke formation and dove into the confusion, weapons firing at precise, pre-selected points on the Thren hulls that our engineers had identified as vulnerable during their analysis of the outpost attack footage. It was not overwhelming force. It was precision, applied exactly where it would matter most. The Thren strike group, so disciplined moments before, scattered in visible disarray. Ships that had moved in perfect formation now moved independently, some retreating, some attempting to regroup, none of them behaving with the same terrifying coordination they had shown at the start. Beside me, one of my younger pilots, a quiet woman named Claire Ashford, broke formation briefly to circle back toward a Thren vessel drifting helplessly amid the wreckage, its crew clearly disabled but its hull still intact. For a moment, I feared she meant to finish it off, but instead she simply marked its position for recovery teams and pulled away. "We are not here to slaughter helpless ships," she said over the comm, almost apologetically, as though she expected to be questioned for the choice. "We are here to make them leave." Nobody questioned her. I do not think anyone wanted to. "They are pulling back," Nathan Price reported from the Meridian. "Repeat, Thren forces are retreating." I allowed myself one breath of relief before pulling my squadron back toward safety, watching the remaining Thren vessels vanish into the dark beyond Mars. We had not destroyed them. We had not even come close to matching their raw power, but we had done something far more important. We had made them retreat. When I returned to the Meridian, the atmosphere on the command deck had shifted from the grim determination of 3 days earlier into something closer to controlled excitement. Bennett greeted me with a rare, tired smile. "You did well," she said. "We got lucky," I said. Luck, she said, is what people call preparation when they are too tired to admit they planned for it. I learned later, from intercepted Thren communications that our intelligence teams managed to partially translate, that the retreat had caused something close to disorder within their command structure. The strike group had been led by an officer named, in our rough translation, something close to Overseer Karth. According to the intercepted signal, Karth had reported the engagement as a total failure, citing losses that should have been impossible against a species the Compact had classified as primitive. The response from Thren High Command, translated with less certainty, appeared to express something between confusion and disbelief. They had expected an easy campaign. Instead, in a single skirmish, they had lost 2 vessels and damaged others, all without inflicting a single confirmed loss on our side. For the first time since the declaration, I allowed myself to feel something other than fear. It was not confidence, not yet, but it was hope, and hope was more than we had possessed 3 days earlier. I also learned, during a debrief the following morning, that our victory near the debris field had come with a cost we had not fully understood, in the chaos of the engagement itself. One of the pilots in my squadron, a steady young man named Owen Fairweather, had taken damage during the final pass that our systems had not registered as critical until he was already limping back toward the meridian. He landed safely, but only barely, his ship trailing a thin stream of vented atmosphere the entire way home. I found him afterward in the medical bay, sitting on the edge of a cot while a technician checked him over, looking more embarrassed than injured. "You had us worried," I told him. "I had myself worried," he admitted. "I did not think a graveyard of old satellites would be the thing that nearly got me, of all things out here." "It was not the satellites," I said. "It was flying through them at full speed while somebody 12 times our size was trying to kill us." He managed a tired laugh at that, and I left him to rest, carrying with me a quiet reminder that our victory, however important, had not been without its price. Every engagement, no matter how successful, seemed to carry some cost forward with it, a lesson I suspected would only grow heavier as the war continued. That hope did not last uncontested. The Thren Compact adjusted quickly, sending a smaller, more cautious scouting force 2 days later, testing our defenses with a different approach. This time, they avoided the debris fields entirely, choosing instead to probe our orbital defense network directly, searching for weaknesses in our satellite grid. I was not part of that engagement, but I watched the reports come in from the command deck alongside Bennett. Our satellite defense network, cobbled together from decades of aging equipment and newly rushed upgrades, held longer than anyone expected, thanks largely to a young engineer named Sophie Lang, who had spent the previous 2 days rewriting our targeting software to account for the strange energy signatures the Thren ships gave off. "They are adapting their approach," Sophie said during a briefing, pulling up a display of the scouting force's movements. "But so are we. Every engagement gives us more data. Every piece of data makes the next fight easier." Bennett nodded slowly, studying the display. "And every fight we survive," she said, "teaches them that we are not what they expected." Over the following week, engagements like these repeated across different regions of our solar system, small skirmishes and probing attacks that tested both sides in equal measure. We lost ships, we lost people. I will not pretend otherwise, because pretending would dishonor the sacrifices made in those early days. But for every loss, we adapted faster than the Thren seemed capable of adapting themselves. One evening, after returning from a particularly draining patrol near the edge of the asteroid belt, I sat in the mess hall of the Meridian listening to a group of engineers argue cheerfully over the best way to modify a captured Thren sensor array. There was laughter in that room, real laughter, the kind that had not existed anywhere on the ship during the first grim days of the war. It struck me as strange at first, almost inappropriate given everything happening around us, until I realized what it actually meant. We were adjusting. We were finding, even amid an existential struggle, small pockets of ordinary life to hold on to, because that was simply what people did. It was, I began to suspect, another trait the Thren Compact had never accounted for in their assessment of us. Claire Ashford joined me at the table that night, still in her flight suit, dark circles under her eyes from too many hours in the cockpit. "Do you ever wonder what they thought they were signing up for?" she asked, nodding vaguely toward the ceiling, toward the stars beyond it. "An easy campaign," I said, "a quick, quiet erasure. And instead they got laughter in a mess hall 3 weeks into a war they were supposed to have already won." I could not help but smile at that, tired as I was. I suppose that is one way to put it. I began to understand why, during long conversations with Sophie Lang and the other engineers working around the clock to keep our fleets functional, The Thren Compact, according to everything we could piece together from captured data and intercepted transmissions, had not fought a real war in generations. Their conquests, if that was even the right word, had been closer to formalities, civilizations too weak or too disorganized to resist a fleet of their size. They had grown used to victory without struggle, and that comfort had left them unprepared for a species that refused to simply lie down. Humanity, on the other hand, had never known a version of history without struggle. Every generation before us had fought against something, whether it was disease, famine, each other, or the simple unforgiving difficulty of survival on a planet that offered nothing freely. We had built our entire existence on the foundation of refusing to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. I remember standing beside Ryan Blake after one particularly difficult engagement, watching the recovery teams bring in the wreckage of 2 of our ships. He was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "Do you think they understand yet?" he asked. "What they actually started?" I thought about Overseer Karth's reported confusion, about the retreating scouting force, about the quiet, stubborn determination I had seen spread across every face on Earth since the day of the declaration. "No," I said, "I do not think they do. Not yet. When do you think they will?" I looked out at the stars, thinking of Grace Whitfield's calm voice during the very first attack, of Sophie Lang rewriting our defenses overnight, of Laura Bennett's steady hands guiding a fractured planet into something resembling unity within hours of an impossible threat. "Soon," I said. "I think it will be soon." I did not know, standing there in the aftermath of that skirmish, just how right I was about to be, or how much the coming weeks would change not just the war itself, but the way the Thren Compact understood the meaning of the word enemy. 3 weeks into the war, we captured a Thren officer alive, and everything I thought I understood about our enemy began to change. It happened during a salvage operation near the wreckage of a disabled scout vessel, one of the ships damaged during an earlier skirmish and left drifting after its crew apparently abandoned any attempt at repair. Our recovery teams expected to find only empty compartments and broken systems. Instead, they found a single surviving officer, trapped in a sealed section of the ship, alive but weak, having spent days without functioning life support. I was present when they brought him aboard the Meridian. His name, translated as closely as our systems could manage, was something close to Van Threl. He did not resist capture. He did not appear frightened either. He simply watched us with the same unreadable expression I remembered from the very first transmission 3 weeks earlier, as though he were still cataloging us, still trying to understand what kind of creatures had done this to his ship. Laura Bennett insisted on being present for the first interview, along with a translator team led by Sophie Lang, who had spent the past weeks becoming something of an expert in the fragments of Thren language we had managed to decode. I was allowed to observe from the edge of the room, close enough to hear everything. "You are being treated according to the laws governing prisoners of conflict," Bennett said, her voice calm and level. "You will not be harmed. We are not interested in cruelty, we are interested in understanding." Van Threl studied her for a long moment before responding, his translated voice carrying that same smooth, careful tone I remembered. "You should not exist in this state," he said. "Our reports described a species divided against itself, incapable of sustained cooperation. Yet here I am, treated with more order and restraint than I expected from a civilization judged primitive." "Your reports were wrong," Bennett said simply. "Clearly," Van Threl said. There was something in his tone that might have been the alien equivalent of frustration, though it was difficult to be certain through the imperfect translation. "The Compact does not make errors of this scale, not in generations." Over the following days, as his condition improved and trust, of a limited and cautious kind, slowly developed between him and our intelligence teams, Van Threl revealed more than I think even he intended to share. Whether it came from genuine willingness to cooperate, or simply from the isolation of finding himself completely cut off from his own people, I never fully knew. But what he told us reshaped our entire understanding of the war. The Thren Compact, he explained, was not a single unified species, but an alliance of 3, bound together generations earlier, through a treaty formed after their homeworlds nearly destroyed each other in a devastating conflict. Rather than continuing to fight, the 3 species had agreed to combine their strength and turn their attention outward, expanding across neighboring systems, and absorbing or eliminating any civilization judged insufficiently developed or insufficiently useful. For generations, Van Threl said, this expansion faced no meaningful resistance. Civilizations we encountered either joined the Compact peacefully, recognizing the futility of resistance, or were removed with minimal cost to our forces. Your species was expected to follow one of those two patterns. But we did not, Sophie Lang said. No, he agreed. You did not. He explained that the Compact's assessment of humanity had been based largely on intercepted communications, decades-old broadcasts drifting through space, entertainment and news signals never intended to represent an accurate picture of an entire civilization. Their analysts had studied our fictional conflicts, our dramatized disagreements, our worst arguments broadcast for entertainment, and concluded that humanity was a species defined by division rather than unity. They believed our stories were reality, I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else in the room, but Van Threll's attention shifted to me regardless. Your stories, he said, showed us a species obsessed with conflict among yourselves. It did not occur to our analysts that a species could hold such conflicts internally, while still uniting completely against an outside threat. It is not a behavior we have observed before, not from any species. Bennett exchanged a glance with Sophie Lang before speaking again. And now that you have observed it? Van Threll was quiet for a long moment. Now, he said, I do not know what my people believe. I have been separated from the Compact for many days, but I suspect the confusion I feel is shared, at least among those directly engaging your forces. That confusion, it turned out, ran deeper than any of us had realized. Using information carefully gathered from Van Threll, combined with data recovered from the wreckage of his scout vessel, our engineering teams made significant progress reverse engineering fragments of Thren technology over the following 2 weeks. Progress was slow and difficult, built on long nights and repeated failures, but every small success gave our fleets an edge they had not possessed before. I remember standing in the engineering bay of the Meridian, watching Sophie Lang and her team work through the early hours of the morning, piecing together a partially functional Thren shield emitter recovered from the wreckage. It should not be this complicated, she muttered at one point, adjusting a set of connections for what felt like the 100th time. Their technology is advanced, but the underlying principles are not impossible to understand. They have simply never had to explain their systems to anyone who was not already part of their alliance. You think they built everything assuming nobody would ever need to reverse engineer it, I said. I think, Sophie said, finally getting the emitter to power on with a faint hum, that they built everything assuming they would never lose. That assumption, it seemed, was beginning to crack across the wider Thren Compact as well. Through continued interviews with Van Threll, and through fragments of intercepted communication our analysts managed to decode, we began piecing together a picture of growing disagreement within the Alliance itself. The 3 species that made up the Compact, Van Threll explained, had never fully trusted one another. Their alliance built more on shared benefit than genuine unity. As losses mounted against human forces, that fragile trust began to strain. One faction, representing the species Van Threll belonged to, argued for a more cautious, calculated approach, gathering intelligence and adapting tactics before committing further resources. Another faction argued for an immediate, overwhelming assault, believing that continued hesitation only made the Compact appear weak. During one of these conversations, I asked Van Threll something that had been sitting with me for days. If your people distrust each other so deeply, I said, why did the alliance last as long as it has? He considered the question with the same careful patience he seemed to bring to everything. Because expansion was profitable, and profit is a powerful adhesive, he said, each species within the Compact received resources, territory, and security in exchange for contributing forces to the Alliance's campaigns. As long as those campaigns succeeded easily, the arrangement required no deeper trust. It simply required continued success. And now that the campaigns are not succeeding easily, now, he said, the arrangement is being tested for the first time in generations, and I am not certain it was ever built to withstand a true test. They fear appearing weak to each other more than they fear you, Van Threll admitted during one of our later conversations. The alliance was never built on true trust. It was built on the assumption that unity against outsiders was more profitable than conflict among ourselves. That assumption is being tested now, in ways it has never been tested before. Bennett, who had been listening quietly from across the room, finally spoke. Then perhaps it is time we tested it further. What followed was the first true offensive operation of the war, planned over the course of several tense days by a joint command team drawing on intelligence from Van Threll, reverse-engineered Thren technology, and a growing confidence among our forces that had been steadily building since that first skirmish near the debris field. The target was a Thren supply depot located in the outer system, a facility responsible for coordinating fuel and repairs for their forward operating fleet. Destroying or disabling it would not win the war outright, but it would force the compact to divert resources and attention away from any planned assault on Earth itself, buying us critical time to continue strengthening our defenses. I was given command of the strike force, a mixed group of human interceptors alongside 2 newly modified vessels equipped with partially functional Thren shielding, the product of weeks of careful engineering work led by Sophie Lang's team. These systems are not fully stable, Sophie warned me during the final briefing before launch. You may lose shielding entirely if you push them too hard, but when they work, they should let you absorb hits that would otherwise cripple your ships. Understood, I said, though I could feel the weight of what she was telling me settle heavily in my chest. We were about to test unfinished, unproven technology in the middle of an active combat zone, with lives depending on whether it worked as intended. Before launch, I gathered the small strike team in the briefing room one final time. Claire Ashford was among them, along with Owen Fairweather, fully recovered from his injuries weeks earlier and eager to prove the ship beneath him could handle whatever came next. I looked around at their faces, tired but steady, and found myself thinking, not for the first time, how strange it was to place so much trust in people I had known for such a short span of time, and how completely that trust had been earned regardless. This is not a battle we win through force, I told them. The depot is too well defended for a direct assault to succeed cleanly. This is a battle we win through precision, through timing, and through trusting that everyone in this room will do exactly what we planned, exactly when we planned it. If any part of that plan breaks down, we adapt, the same way we have adapted through every engagement so far. Claire nodded slowly. And if the shielding fails? Then we rely on everything else that has carried us this far, I said. Each other. Nobody spoke after that. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said, in one form or another, through every difficult day since the declaration of war. The approach to the supply depot took nearly 6 hours, moving carefully through quiet stretches of space to avoid detection for as long as possible. I spent much of that time going over the plan again and again in my mind, checking every detail, every contingency, trying to account for anything that might go wrong. When we finally arrived, the depot came into view exactly as our intelligence had described it, a sprawling structure surrounded by a modest defensive screen of smaller vessels, clearly not expecting a direct assault this deep into what the compact still considered secure territory. Steady, I said over the comm, watching my squadron hold formation as we closed the final distance. Wait for my signal. The defensive screen noticed us moments before we struck, but by then, it was already too late for them to properly organize a response. My squadron split into 3 groups, striking the depot's power core, its communication array, and its defensive weapon systems simultaneously, exactly as we had planned during those long hours of preparation. The modified shielding held, absorbing hits that would have destroyed our ships outright only weeks earlier. I felt the strange humming resistance of the Thren technology working exactly as Sophie had hoped, buying us the extra seconds needed to complete our strikes and pull back before the depot's remaining defenses could properly regroup. By the time we disengaged, the depot's power core was crippled, its communication array destroyed, and a significant portion of its defensive fleet disabled or destroyed entirely. We had lost 2 ships in the engagement, a cost that weighed heavily on me even as we returned to the Meridian to a reception of quiet, exhausted relief rather than celebration. Bennett met me personally when I returned, her expression carrying the same complicated mixture of pride and grief that I imagine mirrored my own. You did well, she said again, echoing the words from that very first skirmish weeks earlier. We lost 2 ships, I said quietly. I know, she said, and we will grieve for them properly, as we always do. But because of what you accomplished today, the compact's forward operations in this system will be delayed for weeks, possibly longer. That delay may save far more lives than we lost. I nodded, though the weight of the loss did not lessen simply because I understood the reasoning behind it. Later, walking through the recovery bay where the damaged ships were being brought in for repair, I found Claire Ashford sitting quietly beside the wreckage of one of the 2 vessels we had lost, her hand resting against the scorched hull as though the gesture might somehow reach the crew who had not made it back. I did not interrupt her. I simply stood nearby for a while, letting her have the moment, before she finally spoke without looking up. We keep winning, she said quietly, and it still cost this much. I do not think that changes, I said. I think we simply learn to carry it differently. She was quiet for a long time after that, and eventually I left her there, understanding that some grief needed space rather than company, even from those who shared it. Later that night, I visited Van Threl in the secure quarters where he had been staying since his capture. I found him staring quietly at a small viewport, watching the distant stars beyond the ship's hull. "You struck the depot," he said without turning around. I felt the shift in the ship's systems when reports began circulating. "We did," I said. "The Compact will not take this quietly," he said. "The faction favoring immediate, overwhelming force will use this as justification. They will argue that hesitation has already cost too much. And the other faction?" Van Threl finally turned to face me. His expression, as always, difficult to fully read. "The other faction will argue that immediate force has already failed twice, and that greater caution is needed before committing further resources to a war that is no longer proceeding as expected." "Which faction do you believe will win that argument?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I do not know," he said, "but I suspect, either way, the Compact is beginning to understand something it has never had to understand before." "What is that?" "That it may have declared war on the wrong enemy," he said, "and that understanding, once it fully takes hold, may prove far more dangerous to us than any weapon you have built." I stood there in the quiet of that room, looking out at the same stars Van Threl had been watching moments earlier, and I understood, with a clarity that settled deep into my chest, that the war we were fighting was no longer simply a matter of survival. It had become something else entirely, a test not just of our defenses, but of everything humanity had ever claimed to be. And somewhere out among those stars, an alliance built on convenience rather than trust was beginning to come apart at the seams, exactly as we needed it to. The message came in the middle of the night, waking me from the first real sleep I had gotten in days. The Thren Compact had committed their full remaining strength to a single decisive assault, gathering their forces near the rings of Saturn in what our analysts believed was an attempt to end the war before internal divisions tore the alliance apart completely. I was on the command deck within minutes, standing beside Laura Bennett as the tactical display filled with an overwhelming number of Thren vessels, far more than we had faced in any engagement since the war began. "This is everything they have," Nathan Price said quietly, staring at the numbers scrolling across his console. "Every faction, every remaining ship. They are not holding anything back." Bennett's expression remained calm, though I could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. "Then we will not hold anything back either," she said. Every human fleet across the solar system had been called into position over the previous 2 days, gathering near Saturn in a formation built from weeks of hard-learned lessons and painfully earned experience. I stood in the launch bay hours later, checking the systems of my ship one final time, aware that whatever happened in the coming hours would decide far more than the outcome of a single battle. Claire Ashford passed by on her way to her own ship, pausing just long enough to rest a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Whatever happens out there," she said, "it has been an honor flying beside you, Elias." "Do not talk like that," I said, though I understood exactly why she felt the need to say it. "I am not talking like anything," she said, offering a small, tired smile. "I am simply telling the truth while I still have the chance to." She moved on before I could respond, and I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of her words settle into me, alongside everything else. Ryan Blake found me there, running through his own final checks nearby. "Feels different this time," he said. "It is different," I said. "This is the one they need to win. Then I suppose it is the one we need to win more." I managed a tired smile at that, though the weight in my chest made it difficult to hold for long. We had lost people throughout this war, good people, and I understood, standing there in the quiet moments before launch, that today we would likely lose more. The battle began the moment our fleets came within range of each other, an explosion of light and motion that filled the space around Saturn's rings with more activity than I had ever witnessed. Thren vessels advanced in tight, coordinated formations, their weapons far more powerful than anything we had faced in earlier skirmishes. Our own fleets, smaller but faster, wove between their formations, striking precise, calculated targets before pulling back to avoid direct confrontation whenever possible. I led my squadron through the opening waves of the assault, coordinating strikes against Thren support vessels, while larger human warships engaged their main battle line directly. The modified shielding technology, refined significantly since the supply depot raid, allowed our ships to absorb damage that would have been fatal only weeks earlier, buying precious seconds in engagements that would otherwise have ended in an instant. I watched Owen Fairweather's ship cut brilliantly through a formation of smaller Thren escorts, drawing 3 of them away from a larger human cruiser struggling under sustained fire. It was a dangerous, nearly reckless maneuver, but it worked exactly as he intended. buying the cruiser enough time to reroute power to its main weapons and turn the engagement in our favor. Across the battlefield, similar moments repeated themselves again and again, pilots and crews making split-second decisions built on weeks of hard-earned trust in one another, decisions that no single tactical plan could have accounted for in advance. Hours passed in a blur of motion and tension, our forces slowly gaining ground through sheer coordination and adaptability, exactly the traits the Thren Compact had never expected us to possess. But then, just as it seemed our formations were beginning to overwhelm their forward line, the Thren flagship activated something our sensors had never detected before. New energy signature. Sophie Lang's voice came through, tense and urgent, from her station aboard the Meridian. It is building rapidly. I do not recognize the pattern. The Thren flagship, larger than any vessel we had encountered, began to glow along its hull with a deep, pulsing light. Bennett's voice cut through the chaos of the comm channels, sharp and immediate. All units, fall back from the flagship, immediately. I pulled my squadron away as quickly as our engines allowed, watching the strange light building along the flagship's hull grow brighter with each passing second. Then, without warning, it released. A wave of energy tore through the battlefield, wider and more devastating than anything I had witnessed in this war. Ships caught directly in its path, both Thren and human, were disabled instantly, their systems overwhelmed by the sheer force of the discharge. I felt my own ship shudder violently as the edge of the wave passed close by, alarms blaring across every console as backup systems struggled to compensate. Casualty reports coming in. Nathan Price's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. We have lost multiple vessels across the fleet. I scanned my own squadron's status, my chest tightening as I counted the responding signals. 5 ships answered. 6 had launched with me that morning. Ryan, I said, my voice tight. Ryan, respond. Silence answered me. I searched the wreckage scattered across my display, forcing myself to remain focused despite the sudden, sharp grief threatening to overwhelm me. I found his ship eventually, drifting silently among the debris, its systems dark and unresponsive. There was no time to grieve properly, not in the middle of an active battlefield, but I felt the loss settle into me regardless, heavy and immediate, a weight I would carry long after this battle ended. Elias, Bennett's voice came through, steady despite everything happening around her. I need you focused. We cannot let that weapon recharge. I forced myself to push the grief aside, at least for now, and refocused on the battle unfolding around me. Our engineers, working frantically from data gathered during the weapon's discharge, identified a critical weakness in the flagship's power distribution system, a flaw that had likely never been tested under this kind of sustained combat pressure. The weapon draws power from across the entire vessel, Sophie Lang reported, her voice quick and urgent. If we can strike the secondary power relays before it fully recharges, we may be able to prevent it from firing again. Bennett did not hesitate. Elias, your squadron has the best chance of reaching those relays. Can you do it? I looked at the remaining pilots under my command, 5 exhausted, grieving faces waiting for my answer. I thought of Ryan Blake's easy smile hours earlier, of Grace Whitfield's calm refusal to be afraid during that very first attack, of every person across this war who had chosen to stand and fight rather than accept the fate the Thren Compact believed was inevitable. We can do it, I said. We moved as one, weaving through the chaos of the ongoing battle toward the flagship's secondary power relays, protected by the combined efforts of every remaining human vessel drawing Thren fire away from our approach. It was, I would later understand, one of the clearest examples of the unity Van Threl had described, dozens of pilots working together without hesitation, each one trusting the others completely despite the overwhelming danger surrounding us. We reached the relays with seconds to spare, before the weapon's second charge would have completed. Our combined strikes tore through the exposed systems, disabling the weapon entirely and sending a visible shudder through the flagship's massive hull. For a long moment, the battlefield fell eerily quiet, both sides seemingly stunned by what had just happened. Then, slowly, the Thren formations began to break apart, ships pulling back from direct engagement, their coordinated assault collapsing into disorganized retreat. An open channel activated moments later, broadcasting across every human vessel still active in the battle. The voice that came through was different from the smooth, careful tone of that first declaration weeks earlier. It carried something unmistakably close to disbelief. "What are you?" the voice asked, simple and direct, stripped of all the formal, clinical language of that original transmission. "We have fought civilizations older than your entire species. We have never encountered this." Bennett's response came steady and clear. broadcast across the same open channel for every remaining Thren vessel to hear. "We are the ones who refuse to disappear quietly," she said. "You may want to remember that." The channel closed. The remaining Thren forces continued their retreat, pulling back beyond the edge of the solar system as our own fleets, exhausted and grieving but victorious, began the long process of recovering the wreckage, and the survivors scattered across the battlefield. Claire Ashford found me shortly after the retreat began, her ship pulling alongside mine as we made our way back toward the meridian through the scattered wreckage of the battle. Her voice, when it came through the comm, was quiet and unsteady in a way I had never heard from her before. "We made it," she said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "We made it," I confirmed. "I did not think we would," she admitted. "Not really. I kept flying because there was nothing else to do, but somewhere in the middle of that weapon firing, I stopped believing we would see the other side of it." "I understand," I said, because I did, more fully than I wanted to admit even to myself. We flew the rest of the way back in silence, and I found myself grateful for her honesty, grateful that even amid victory, none of us pretended the fear had not been real. I found myself standing later that night in the quiet of the Meridian's small memorial chamber, a room that had been added only weeks into the war, already carrying more names than any of us had expected to need. I stood in front of Ryan Blake's name, freshly added among the others, and allowed myself, finally, to feel the full weight of everything the day had cost. Laura Bennett found me there sometime later, standing quietly beside me without speaking for a long while. Sophie Lang joined us not long after, still wearing the exhausted, unfocused look of someone who had spent the entire battle buried in data streams and emergency repairs. She stood quietly on my other side, studying the names on the wall with an expression I recognized from every engineer I had come to know throughout the war, the particular grief of someone who built things meant to protect people, and now had to reckon with the moments those things had not been enough. "The shielding held for most of the fleet," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It should have held for all of them." "It held as well as anything could have against a weapon like that," Bennett said gently. "You gave us the seconds we needed to reach those relays. Without that, today would have ended very differently." Sophie did not respond immediately, her gaze still fixed on the wall of names. "I know," she said eventually. "I know that. It does not make this part easier." "We won," I said eventually, my voice hollow. "We survived," she said gently. "There is a difference, and I think it matters that we remember it." I nodded, thinking of Ryan's easy smile, of the 5 pilots who had trusted me completely during those final desperate moments of the battle, of every name now etched into the wall in front of me. "What happens now?" I asked. Bennett was quiet for a long moment, studying the names alongside me. "Now," she said, "we find out whether the Thren Compact understands what today truly meant, because I do not believe they came here expecting to lose, and I do not believe they are prepared for what it means to have been wrong about us." I looked back at the wall of names, at the weight of everything we had sacrificed to reach this moment, and I understood, with a certainty that settled deep and permanent into my chest, that whatever came next, humanity would face it exactly as we had faced everything before. Together, and without surrender. 6 weeks after the battle near Saturn's rings, the Thren Compact requested a formal ceasefire, and I found myself standing in a room I never expected to enter, watching representatives of an alliance that had once declared our extinction now sit quietly across a table from human diplomats. I had been asked to attend as a military witness, one of several officers present to answer questions about the engagements that had shaped the final weeks of the war. Laura Bennett sat near the head of the table, calm as always, though I could see in the careful way she held herself that even she found this moment difficult to fully process. The Thren delegation was smaller than I expected, only 4 representatives, each from a different faction within the compact, seated together with an uneasy stiffness that suggested their own internal disagreements had not fully healed, even in defeat. Among them, to my quiet surprise, sat Van Threll, no longer a prisoner, but an official intermediary chosen, according to the brief explanation given before the meeting began, because of his unique understanding of human behavior gained during his time aboard the Meridian. He caught my eye briefly across the room and offered the smallest nod of acknowledgement before the proceedings began. The formal ceasefire discussions stretched across several long days, filled with careful, exhausting negotiation over terms neither side seemed fully prepared to agree upon easily. The compact wished to withdraw entirely from human space, while preserving what remained of their reputation among other civilizations they had previously subdued. Human negotiators, understandably, wanted assurances that this withdrawal would be permanent, along with reparations for the lives lost during the conflict. I did not participate directly in most of these discussions, but I listened closely whenever I was present, watching the slow, careful process of two civilizations that had tried to destroy each other, now attempting to build something resembling peace instead. During a break in negotiations on the third day, I found myself alone in a quiet observation room, staring out at the distant curve of Earth below. Van Threl joined me there without announcement, standing quietly beside me for a long moment before speaking. "You seem troubled," he said. "I am tired," I said honestly. "Tired in a way that sleep does not seem to fix." "That is understandable," he said. "War leaves marks that do not fade simply because the fighting has ended." I glanced at him, considering the strange path that had brought us to this quiet moment, standing side by side after everything that had happened between our people. "Why did you agree to serve as an intermediary?" I asked. He considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I understand your species better than most within the compact, and because I believe, perhaps foolishly, that understanding may prevent further unnecessary conflict." "Do you regret what the compact did?" I asked. "Declaring war on us?" Van Threl was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant curve of Earth below us. "I regret the assumptions that led to it," he said finally. "The compact believed it understood humanity through fragments of entertainment and old broadcasts, never imagining that a species capable of such vivid internal disagreement could unite so completely against an external threat. That misunderstanding cost lives on both sides. I regret that deeply." "And now?" I asked. "What do you believe now?" He turned to face me fully, his expression carrying something I had never quite seen from him before. Something close to genuine curiosity, rather than simple analysis. "Now," he said, "I believe the compact made a very particular kind of mistake. We assumed a species judged primitive by our standards would behave predictably, would either submit or collapse under pressure exactly as every other civilization we encountered before you. We never considered that we might be facing something built differently, something that grows stronger precisely because of the very struggles we believed marked you as weak." I thought about that for a long moment, remembering Grace Whitfield's calm refusal to be afraid, Sophie Lang's exhausted determination through countless sleepless nights, Ryan Blake's easy smile even in the final hours before his death, Laura Bennett steadying an entire fractured planet within hours of an impossible threat. "We have always struggled," I said quietly, "against disease, against each other, against a planet that never gave us anything freely. I suppose we simply never learned how to stop fighting, even when the fight seemed impossible." "That," Van Threl said, "is precisely what the compact failed to understand. You did not declare this war. We did, but you fought it, as though every version of your species that had ever refused to disappear quietly was standing behind you, refusing to let you fall." His words settled into me with a weight I had not expected, and I found myself unable to respond immediately, simply staring out at the quiet curve of Earth below, thinking of everyone who had brought us to this fragile, uncertain peace. On the fifth day of negotiations, a disagreement broke out among the human delegation itself, several diplomats arguing sharply over how far to push the compact on the question of reparations. For a moment, watching voices rise around that table, I felt an old, familiar unease settle into my chest. The same unease I imagined the Thren analysts must have felt studying our earliest broadcasts, wondering if a species capable of such disagreement could ever hold together under pressure. But then Laura Bennett raised a single hand, and the room quieted almost instantly. "We disagree because we care about getting this right," she said, "not because we are incapable of standing together when it matters. Let us not confuse the two." The argument settled from there, not because everyone suddenly agreed, but because everyone remembered, in that moment, exactly what unity had cost us to build, and exactly why it remained worth protecting. I mentioned the exchange to Van Threl afterward, curious how it had appeared from his side of the table. He considered it for a long moment before responding. "It was informative," he said. "Among my own delegation, disagreement of that kind would have been handled through private channels, away from outside observation, to preserve the appearance of unity. Your delegation argued openly, resolved it openly, and returned to the table within minutes, still functioning as a single unit. I do not believe the compact has ever fully understood that those two things, open disagreement and genuine unity, are not opposites for your species. They coexist." "They have to," I said. "Pretending we agree on everything has never worked for us. We simply learned, a long time ago, how to keep moving forward anyway." The ceasefire was formally signed on the 7th day of negotiations, accompanied by an agreement that the Thren Compact would withdraw entirely from human territory, offer reparations for the damage caused during the conflict, and establish a limited diplomatic relationship intended to prevent future misunderstandings between our civilizations. It was not a perfect peace. Deep mistrust remained on both sides, and I suspected it would take generations before that mistrust fully faded, if it ever did. But it was peace, fragile and uncertain as it was, and after everything we had lived through, that felt like more than enough for now. In the months that followed, life slowly began returning to something resembling normalcy, though normalcy itself had been permanently reshaped by everything we had experienced. Reconstruction efforts spread across every region touched by the conflict, rebuilding not just physical structures, but the fragile sense of security that had been stripped away the moment those 3 Thren vessels first appeared beyond Neptune. I attended more memorial services than I ever wanted to count, standing beside grieving families as name after name was added to walls similar to the one aboard the Meridian. I visited Ryan Blake's family personally, sharing stories of his quiet courage during those final desperate moments before the battle turned in our favor. His parents listened quietly, grief etched deeply into their faces, but I saw something else there too, a quiet pride that mirrored what I had seen spread across the entire planet during the war itself. Claire Ashford left active service not long after the ceasefire, choosing instead to train the next generation of pilots at a newly established academy, built specifically around the lessons learned during the war. I visited her there once, watching from a distance as she guided a group of nervous new recruits through basic formation drills, her voice carrying the same steady confidence I remembered from our earliest engagements together. "You are good at this," I told her afterward, over a quiet meal in the academy's small dining hall. "I am good at surviving impossible odds," she said. It seemed worth teaching, given everything we went through to learn it. Owen Fairweather stayed in active service, eventually taking command of his own squadron, one built partly from the very same modified shielding technology that had carried us through the depot raid and the battle at Saturn. I received occasional updates from him over the following months, brief messages describing routine patrols along the edges of human territory, quiet reminders that peace, however fragile, was slowly becoming something we could rely on rather than something we simply hoped for. Laura Bennett was promoted to oversee the newly formed Joint Defense Council, a position that placed her at the center of humanity's ongoing relationship with the wider galactic community that had, until recently, remained entirely unaware of our existence. Word of our victory against the Thren Compact had apparently spread quickly among other civilizations, many of whom had lived for generations under the assumption that resistance against the Compact was simply impossible. I learned, through occasional updates from Bennett's office, that several smaller civilizations previously absorbed into the Compact's influence had begun quietly reconsidering their own positions, inspired by humanity's unexpected defiance. Whether that would lead to further conflict or simply a gradual shift in the balance of power among the stars, none of us could say for certain. But it was clear that the galaxy's understanding of what humanity represented had changed permanently, in ways that would likely shape our future for generations to come. Sophie Lang continued her work refining the reverse-engineered technology gathered throughout the war, eventually leading a growing division dedicated to understanding and safely integrating alien technology into human systems. I visited her lab occasionally, always finding her exactly where I expected, surrounded by half-finished projects and the same quiet, stubborn determination that had helped carry us through the darkest days of the conflict. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing everything?" I asked her during one such visit, watching her carefully adjust a piece of modified shielding equipment. She paused, considering the question seriously before answering. "Every day," she said. "But I think about something else more often." "What is that?" "How close we came to proving exactly what they believed about us," she said, "and how proud I am that we did not." I thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed, especially during the quiet evenings, when the weight of everything the war had cost us settled most heavily. It would have been easy, in the darkest moments of that conflict, to let fear and grief pull us apart rather than together. Every civilization the Compact had encountered before us had apparently made that very choice, collapsing under pressure exactly as their analysts predicted. We had come close to the same fate more than once, and I understood, looking back, that our survival had never been guaranteed simply because we were human. It had been earned, deliberately and painfully, by people choosing, again and again, to stand beside one another instead of turning away. I found myself thinking about those words often in the months that followed, standing occasionally at the observation window of the Meridian, watching the same stars that had once carried the threat of our extinction, now carrying something closer to cautious, uncertain hope. Van Threl and I maintained an unlikely correspondence throughout that first year of peace, exchanging messages that gradually shifted from formal diplomatic updates into something closer to genuine friendship, however strange that friendship might have seemed to those who witnessed its beginning during the darkest days of the war. During one such exchange, nearly a year after the ceasefire was signed, he asked me a question that lingered with me long after our conversation ended. "Do you believe the compact could have avoided this outcome?" he asked, "if we had approached your species differently from the beginning?" I considered the question carefully before responding, thinking of everything that had brought us to this fragile, uncertain peace, every loss, every hard-fought victory, every quiet moment of unity that had carried humanity through the impossible. "I do not know," I said honestly. "Perhaps, if you had approached us with curiosity instead of judgment, this could have unfolded differently. But I think there is something important in what did happen, something the compact needed to understand, and perhaps something we needed to understand about ourselves as well." "What is that?" he asked. I thought about the answer for a long moment before finally putting it into words. "You did not simply declare war on humanity," I said. "You declared war on every version of us that has ever refused to disappear quietly, every generation that faced impossible odds and chose to stand anyway. You met the accumulated weight of that stubborn refusal all at once, and I do not think anything in your history had prepared you for what that would mean." Van Threl was quiet for a long moment on the other end of our connection before responding. "No," he said finally. "Nothing had prepared us for that. I do not believe anything could have." I closed that conversation feeling something I had not expected to feel again so soon after everything the war had cost us. It was not triumph exactly, and it was not simple relief either. It was something quieter, steadier, a feeling that had carried humanity through every impossible challenge we had ever faced, long before the Thren Compact ever appeared beyond the edge of our solar system. It was the quiet, stubborn certainty that whatever came next, we would face it exactly as we always had. Together, and without surrender, the stars beyond the observation window remained as vast and uncertain as they had always been, holding countless unknown civilizations, countless unknown futures, countless challenges still waiting somewhere in that endless dark. But for the first time since those 3 Thren vessels had first appeared beyond Neptune, I found myself looking out at that vastness without fear. Because whatever waited out there, humanity had already shown, in the clearest way possible, exactly what happened when someone mistook our quiet endurance for weakness. We did not break. We adapted, we united, and we endured, exactly as we always had, exactly as we always would. And somewhere among those distant stars, I suspected countless other civilizations were only now beginning to understand what that truly meant. The war was over, but the story of what humanity had become because of it was only just beginning.